At 1131 hours on the 4th of May 1945, a Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter emerges from cloud cover 3,000 feet above HMS Formidable. The British aircraft carrier steams 50 miles south of the Sakishima Islands, her deck crowded with 11 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers being pushed forward of the crash barriers. 2 Corsair fighters have just launched from her flight deck. They are turning back now, vectored to defend their mothership. The Zero carries a 250-kilogram bomb beneath its fuselage. The pilot has already made his decision. He will not miss. On Formidable's flight deck, sailors push the unburnt aircraft clear. A petty officer directs an Avenger toward the forward parking area. Neither man looks up. The destroyer's screen opens fire. The carriers begin their turn to starboard. The barrage is light. There are only destroyers available to supplement the carrier's own defenses. The kamikaze is not immediately engaged by Formidable herself. Some accounts suggest the carrier was caught completely by surprise. The Zero dives. The pilot pulls out of his attack run. He circles once, banking through the scattered defensive fire. He is not satisfied with his angle of approach. He comes around again at 1131 and 40 seconds. The aircraft strikes Formidable's flight deck slightly forward of the island superstructure. On the starboard side, the bomb detonates. The aircraft disintegrates. Metal fragments spray across the deck and into the island structure. Burning aviation fuel gushes in every direction. One Avenger, positioned directly abreast the island, explodes immediately. The pilot and the petty officer who had been directing it die of their wounds later that day. 7 other aircraft on deck burst into flames. The flight deck does not collapse. It does not rupture. It does not tear open to expose the hangar below. It dents. HMS Formidable was built on a principle that defied the prevailing wisdom of carrier warfare. While American naval architects designed their flat tops with wooden flight decks and emphasized aircraft capacity above all else, the British had made a different calculation. They assumed their carriers would operate within range of land-based bombers. They assumed those bombers would score hits. They built their ships accordingly. The illustrious class carriers, of which Formidable was the second to be commissioned, incorporated what the Royal Navy called an armored box. The flight deck itself was 3 inches of hardened steel plate, forming the strength deck of the vessel. This was revolutionary. Every other major navy positioned the strength deck lower in the ship for stability reasons. The British engineers made the armored flight deck an integral part of the hull structure, a feat of engineering that required main deck beams 6 feet deep and extensive weight calculations to maintain stability within treaty limitations. The armored flight deck extended for approximately 468 feet, covering roughly 62% of the total deck length and bounded by the 2 aircraft lifts. The lifts themselves were not armored. The deck was closed by 4.5-inch armored sides and bulkheads, forming a protective citadel around the hangar. The hangar deck itself was 2.5 inches thick. The entire armored box weighed 1,500 tons. This came at a cost. Formidable displaced 23,000 long tons at standard load, comparable to the American Yorktown class. But where a Yorktown could carry 90 aircraft and routinely operated with 30% stored in a deck park, Formidable was initially limited to 33 aircraft in her single hangar. The hangar ceiling was only 16 feet high, compared to 17 feet 6 inches in American carriers. Larger aircraft designs could not operate from her deck. The Royal Navy accepted these limitations. They built their carriers to take damage and continue fighting. Formidable measured 740 feet overall, 710 feet at the waterline. Her beam was 95 feet 9 inches. She drew 28 feet 10 inches at deep load. 3 Parsons geared steam turbines drove 3 shafts, producing 111,000 shaft horsepower for a maximum speed of 30.5 knots. 6 Admiralty 3 drum boilers supplied the steam. She carried 4,850 long tons of fuel oil, giving her a range of 10,700 nautical miles at 10 knots. Her defensive armament was formidable. 16 quick-firing 4.5-inch dual-purpose guns and 8 twin turrets, 48 2-pounder pom-pom guns and 6 octuple mounts. By the time she reached the Pacific in 1945, she carried 5 single 40mm Bofors power-operated mounts, 7 single 40mm Boffin mounts, 11 twin 20mm mounts, and 12 single 20mm mounts. The 40mm Bofors gun had a maximum range of 10,750 yards, The British had learned that 20mm shells were unlikely to destroy a kamikaze before it struck the ship. Formidable commissioned in November 1940. She spent the first 4 years of war in the Mediterranean and Norwegian waters. She helped cripple the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto at Cape Matapan in March 1941. German Stuka dive bombers struck her with 2 1,000-pound bombs off Crete in May 1941, killing 8 men and wounding 12. But she remained operational. She attacked the German battleship Tirpitz 4 times in the summer of 1944. With minimal effect, in January 1945, she sailed for the Pacific. She joined the British Pacific Fleet in April 1945. Task Force 57, as the Americans designated it, 4 aircraft carriers: Formidable, Victorious, Illustrious, and Indomitable. 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, 11 destroyers. The mission was to suppress Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands during the American assault on Okinawa. The islands lay between Formosa and Okinawa. Japanese aircraft staged through these airfields to attack the American fleet. The British were assigned to neutralize them. The Sakishima Islands presented unique challenges. The airfields were small, easily repaired, and numerous. The British would need to launch continuous strikes over multiple days to keep them suppressed. This meant operating their carriers at high tempo with limited aircraft numbers. By 1945, British doctrine had evolved. Formidable now carried aircraft on her flight deck as well as in the hangar. Her air group had expanded to 54 aircraft, 36 Vought F-4U Corsair fighters and 18 Avengers. The operations off Sakishima began on March 26, 1945. The pattern quickly established itself. 2 days of strikes, 1 day withdrawn for refueling and replenishment. Then back on station. The carriers operated in tight formation, with the battleships and cruisers positioned closer than American doctrine preferred, providing concentrated anti-aircraft firepower. Radar picket cruisers were stationed in the most likely approach directions. The British assumed they would be attacked. They positioned their forces to survive it. On May 4th, Formidable was preparing for another day of strikes. 11 Avengers were spotted on the aft deck, engines running, armed and fueled. 13 Corsairs were airborne, flying combat air patrol or conducting strikes against the islands. The weather was mixed. Clouds at 3,000 feet. Visibility good below the cloud layer. Wind force 4 from 060 degrees. The ship was at damage control state 1. Slightly modified. Special precautions for suicide bomber attack were in effect. All doors and hatches were secured. Fire parties were positioned throughout the ship. The hangar was sealed with armored doors at each lift well. These doors could slide shut in seconds, isolating any fire on the flight deck from the aircraft and aviation fuel stored below. At 1130 hours, radar operators detected aircraft approaching from the northeast. The combat air patrol was directed to intercept. Some aircraft were shot down. Others broke through. The first kamikaze targeted another carrier in the task force. It missed. The second dove on Formidable. The 0 strikes at 1131. The 250-kilogram bomb penetrates approximately 2 feet into the armored deck before detonating. The explosion creates a hole 2 feet square at the point of impact. The surrounding deck plating is depressed over an area 20 feet by 24 feet. The depression reaches depths of up to 3 inches across most of this area. The bomb has struck at the junction of 3 separate armor plates. Fragments from the aircraft and bomb tear through the island superstructure. All bridge and island windows blow inward. Plating is compressed and scorched black. The flight deck sickbay, located directly below the impact point, is penetrated by fragments. Burning aviation fuel gushes through the damaged area into this space and into the firefighting damage control office. Some fuel spills into trunking and flows down into a portion of the hangar and the torpedo workshop beneath the flight deck. Rivers of burning fuel flow across the flight deck and over the side. The Avenger position next to the island explodes. Its fuel tanks rupture. Ammunition begins cooking off. 7 other aircraft catch fire. All the small tractors used to move aircraft are destroyed. From this point forward, aircraft will have to be moved by hand and jeep power. Smoke billows from the carrier. Ships in the surrounding task force can see the flames. The center boiler room takes fragments through a ventilation trunk. A huge rush of steam vents into the space and out the funnel. The boiler room must be evacuated immediately. Steam supply to the fuel oil pump heaters and fans is shut off from auxiliary positions. 2 dynamos shut down. The center shaft is set to neutral. Formidable's maximum speed falls to 18 knots. Sailors emerge from the boat deck with water hoses. They begin spraying water onto the burning fuel. This creates initial confusion. Water on burning gasoline spreads the fire rather than extinguishing it. The flight deck fire parties move forward with foam equipment. They know their procedures: foam only. No water on fuel fires. The fires are brought under control within 15 minutes. By 11:45, all fires on the flight deck are extinguished. Below decks, damage control parties work to restore power and steam. They divert steam from the starboard boiler room to the center engine room. By 1300 hours, the center shaft is restored to half power. Maximum speed increases to 24 knots. By 0200 hours on May 5th, the center boilers are reconnected to the engines. Full power is restored. On the flight deck, repair crews assess the damage. The dent is 10 feet square, 2 feet deep at the center. The impact has depressed and buckled a deep beam at frame 94. Approximately 90 to 100 rivets have been loosened or gouged out by hot metal. The deck is severely gouged over an area about 5 feet square. The damage is at the intersection of 3 armor plates, 2 feet from the butt joint of a third plate. They fill the depression with rapid-setting concrete and timber. They cover it with thin steel plates, tack welded to the surrounding deck. They work through the afternoon. By 1700 hours, 6 hours after the kamikaze strike, Formidable resumes flight operations. Aircraft begin landing. There is a disconcerting bump in the flight deck now, but the pilots adapt. The carrier remains with the fleet. 8 men are dead, 47 are wounded. 13 Corsairs were airborne at the time of attack. They land on other carriers temporarily, then return to Formidable once her deck is cleared. 11 aircraft have been destroyed. 8 Avengers and 3 Corsairs. Several others are damaged. But Formidable steams at 24 knots. Her flight deck is operational. She continues launching strikes against the Sakashima airfields. The British Pacific Fleet withdraws on May 5th for replenishment. The Japanese have reduced their air activity. Several of Formidable's Corsairs, operating temporarily from HMS Victorious, shoot down a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft at 30,000 feet altitude. On May 8th, the fleet returns to station off Sakashima. Heavy rains force cancellation of planned strikes. On May 9th, operations resume. At 1653 hours on May 9th, anti-Hawk stations are ordered. The flight deck is cleared. 6 Corsairs are spotted on the deck. The weather is fine. Visibility excellent. Wind force 4 from 060 degrees. The ship is at full damage control state 1. All special precautions for suicide bomber attack are in effect. At 1706 hours, a kamikaze appears. Either a Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bomber or a Zero with drop tanks under each wing. Witnesses disagree. The aircraft approaches from red 100 degrees in a shallow dive. Several ships engage it. Formidable fires with her forward and aft pom-pom groups. The aircraft is hit repeatedly. No visible effect is observed. The pilot turns sharply when astern of the ship. He comes in from directly astern at approximately 30 feet altitude. 4 single Oerlikon guns and 2 twin mounts open fire. The aircraft is hit again and again. Pieces fly off. It does not deviate from its course. At 1709 and 30 seconds, the kamikaze crashes onto the flight deck slightly to starboard of the center line, abreast the after end of the island. The aircraft disintegrates on impact. It carries either a 250-pound bomb or a heavy shell. The explosive only partially detonates. 1 Corsair positioned next to the island catches fire immediately. It is extinguished quickly. Another Corsair is blown on top of Pom-Pom Mount number 3. 2 more Corsairs catch fire. The flight deck fire parties attack all 3 fires with foam. All fires are under control by 1725. They are completely extinguished by 1735. 10 minutes later, a fire breaks out in the torpedo parting shop. Burning petrol has leaked down through the lift cover. The fire parties extinguish it with foam. A third fire breaks out in an aircraft in hangar section B. Burning petrol has entered the hangar through rivet holes blown out by the explosion. The saltwater sprinkler system in the hangar is engaged. The fire is quickly doused. The flight deck is depressed 4.5 inches over an area approximately 10 feet square at frame 94. This is the same location struck 5 days earlier. The bomb or shell has hit on the lap joint of 2 armor plates, 2 feet from the butt joint of a third plate. Approximately 90 to 100 rivets are loosened and gouged. The deck is severely gouged by hot metal over an area about 5 feet square. A deep beam at frame 94 is depressed about 2 inches and buckled. 1 man is killed. 8 are wounded. 6 Corsairs and 1 Avenger on the deck are destroyed. 2 additional Corsairs are damaged. The island superstructure is blackened by fire again. Formidable has now been struck by 2 kamikazes in 5 days. Both have hit approximately the same location on the armored deck. Neither has penetrated. Formidable launches and recovers aircraft 40 minutes after the second attack. The dent is filled with concrete and steel plate. Seafire fighters are able to land within 50 minutes of the kamikaze strike. The carrier continues operations off Sakashima. She has lost 17 aircraft in 5 days to combat. Accidents and kamikaze damage. Her air group is depleted, but she remains operational. Compare this to USS Franklin. USS Franklin was an Essex-class fleet carrier. She displaced 27,100 tons standard, 36,380 tons full load. She was larger than Formidable by 4,000 tons. She measured 872 feet overall, 82 feet longer than the British carrier. Her flight deck was 862 feet long, 108 feet wide, constructed of teak planking over steel. The steel beneath was not armored. It was structural. The hangar deck, 2.5 inches of special treatment steel, was the primary armored deck. This design allowed for a larger hangar with higher ceilings. Franklin could carry 90 aircraft routinely. Her standard complement was 80 aircraft with spares. Franklin's protection was designed against 6-inch gunfire at ranges between 11,250 and 18,700 yards. Her side belt armor varied from 2.5 to 4 inches. The steering spaces were enclosed with 4 inches of Class B armor on the sides and 2.5 inches of special treatment steel on top. The hangar deck was 2.5 inches thick. The fourth deck was armored with 1.5 inches of special treatment steel to protect engine and fire rooms. The flight deck had no armor at all. American carrier doctrine emphasized aircraft capacity and offensive striking power. The theory held that the best defense was to destroy enemy forces before they could attack. Carriers would operate beyond the range of land-based aircraft when possible. Fighter combat air patrols would intercept incoming strikes before they reached the fleet. If bombs did hit the ship, the wooden flight deck could be quickly repaired. Damage to one area would not spread through the ship's structure, and aircraft operations could resume rapidly. This doctrine worked well against opponents who lacked sufficient aircraft or could not coordinate massed attacks. It failed catastrophically when a single aircraft penetrated the defenses at the worst possible moment. On March 19, 1945, Franklin operates 52 miles off the coast of Japan. She is closer to the Japanese mainland than any other American carrier during the war. She is part of Task Force 58, launching strikes against airfields on Kyushu and shipping in Kobe Harbor. She has launched her first wave of strikes before dawn. A second set of aircraft is lined up on the flight deck, awaiting launch. 31 aircraft are on deck, fully fueled and armed with bombs and rockets. 22 aircraft are parked in the hangar deck. 16 of these are fueled. 5 are armed. At 0707 hours, a single Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber breaks through the cloud cover. It makes a low-level run over Franklin from stem to stern. It drops 2 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs. The first bomb strikes the flight deck centerline, slightly forward of the island. It punches through the wooden deck. It punches through the hangar deck. It explodes on the second deck, blowing a 15-square-foot hole in the flight deck. The force of the explosion sends the forward aircraft elevator up and out of its shaft. The elevator, weighing 40 tons, is blown upward like a rocket. The second bomb hits aft among the 31 aircraft warming up for launch. It detonates among their fuel tanks. A burst of flame erupts from the flight deck. The aircraft explode one by one. Then in clusters, their bombs detonate. Their rockets ignite. Tiny Tim air-to-surface rockets, each carrying 132 pounds of explosive, scream across the deck. The 11.75-inch rockets were designed to penetrate concrete fortifications. They tear through bulkheads and plating. Some exit the other side of the ship. Machine gun ammunition cooks off in continuous streams. The flight deck becomes an inferno. Fire spreads to the hangar deck. The 22 aircraft parked there catch fire. Their fuel tanks rupture. Their ordnance explodes. The hangar becomes a furnace. Burning gasoline flows down to the gallery deck. Fire spreads to the second and third decks. The Combat Information Center is destroyed. The airplot is destroyed. Fire reaches the magazines. Damage control parties attempt to flood the magazines. Some flooding systems are damaged. Some magazines detonate before they can be flooded. Franklin loses all radio communications. She develops a 13-degree starboard list. She is dead in the water. Massive fires rage on the flight deck, hangar deck, and gallery spaces. The ventilation system, with intakes located at the ends of the armored hangar to minimize openings in the armor, becomes a conduit for smoke and burning gasoline. Fire spreads through the ventilation trunks to spaces throughout the ship. The heavy cruiser, USS Pittsburgh, comes alongside. She takes Franklin under tow. The light cruiser, USS Santa Fe, comes alongside on the other side. She sprays water from fire hoses over the burning carrier. She takes off wounded on stretchers. She evacuates non-essential personnel. Among those evacuated are the surviving members of Air Group 5. They are deemed non-expendable. 59 aircraft are destroyed. 32 Corsair fighters, 15 Avenger torpedo bombers, 7 Helldiver dive bombers, 5 Hellcat fighters. The fires rage for 10 hours. Stubborn smoldering fires in gallery spaces and recurring gasoline fires on the fantail are not completely extinguished until March 22nd, 3 days after the attack. Water pumped aboard to fight fires reduces freeboard. The 15-degree starboard list becomes a 15-degree port list as ballast is pumped to correct it. Franklin's survival is in jeopardy. The carrier's freeboard is so reduced that waves wash over the flight deck. 807 men die in the attack and subsequent fires. At least 487 are wounded. These figures vary slightly between sources depending on whether they include Air Group personnel, Marines in transit, passengers, or men who die of wounds later. Franklin suffers the most severe damage and highest casualties of any United States Navy ship that remains afloat. Only USS Arizona, destroyed at Pearl Harbor, has higher casualties. Franklin proceeds to Ulithi Atoll at 14 knots under her own power for emergency repairs. She then steams to Pearl Harbor. She transits the Panama Canal. She arrives at Brooklyn Navy Yard on April 28th. All West Coast repair yards are overloaded with ships damaged by kamikazes. Franklin steams across the Pacific, through the canal, to New York for repairs. She never returns to combat. She is decommissioned in February 1947. 2 bombs, 53 aircraft fully fueled and armed, no armored flight deck, 807 dead. The contrast is stark. Formidable takes 2 direct kamikaze hits with bombs in 5 days. The armored deck is dented. 17 aircraft are destroyed. 9 men die. Franklin takes 2 bombs while aircraft are being armed and fueled. The unarmored flight deck is penetrated immediately. 807 men die. The ship nearly sinks. A Pacific Fleet report from May 1945 states, without armored decks, Task Force 57 would have been out of action, with 4 carriers, for at least 2 months. This assessment is based on the kamikaze damage sustained by all 4 British carriers off Sakishima. HMS Indomitable is struck by a kamikaze on April 1st. The armored deck prevents penetration. She suffers 30 casualties but remains operational. HMS Victorious is struck twice, once on April 1st and again on May 9th. Both attacks cause fires and casualties. Neither penetrates her armored deck. She continues operations. The debate over armored versus unarmored flight decks consumed naval architects for years. American designers argued that their carriers' greater aircraft capacity and longer range made them superior. They could launch larger strikes from farther away. They could rotate aircraft more frequently. They could sustain operations longer. The wooden flight deck could be rapidly repaired after damage. The British design was seen as defensive, sacrificing offensive capability for survivability. British designers argued that their carriers were intended to operate in restricted waters where they would inevitably come under land-based air attack. They could not avoid being hit. They had to survive hits and continue fighting. The smaller air group was acceptable given the operational environment. The armored deck was essential. Both arguments had merit in their specific contexts. American carriers operated effectively across the vast Pacific, launching massive strikes from beyond the range of most land-based aircraft. When they were hit, the results could be catastrophic. But this happened rarely enough that the doctrine remained viable. British carriers operated in the Mediterranean and Norwegian waters within constant range of German and Italian air bases. They were hit repeatedly. They survived and continued fighting. The Pacific War in 1945 presented a unique challenge. The kamikaze, conventional air attack, could be countered with fighter patrols and anti-aircraft fire. A pilot trying to survive would take evasive action when hit. Break off the attack. Attempt to escape. A kamikaze pilot deliberately flew through defensive fire. He did not evade. He did not break off. He continued until he hit the target or was destroyed. This meant that even light defensive fire that would drive off a conventional attack might only slow a kamikaze. The aircraft might be hit repeatedly, lose pieces, catch fire, but still reach the target if the pilot remained alive and conscious. The wooden flight decks of American carriers offered no protection against this tactic. A kamikaze that reached the flight deck would penetrate. If it struck when aircraft were being armed and fueled, the results were devastating. Franklin and Bunker Hill, struck by kamikazes while preparing strikes, suffered combined casualties of 1,153 killed. Both ships barely survived. Both were repaired but never returned to combat. The British armored carriers demonstrated a different outcome. They could be hit. They were hit. The armored deck prevented penetration. Fires on the flight deck were contained and extinguished. The hangar remained sealed. Aircraft and ordnance stored below were protected. Casualties were minimal. Operations continued. This was not luck. This was design working exactly as intended. After the war, the United States Navy adopted armored flight decks for all future carrier construction. The Midway class, already under construction when the war ended, featured armored flight decks. The supercarriers that followed continued this design. The American assessment was clear. The British had been right. Carriers operating within range of land-based aircraft needed armored protection. The offensive capability sacrificed was less important than the ability to survive hits and continue fighting. But the victory came with hidden costs. Formidable's 2 kamikaze hits in May 1945 caused damage beyond the visible dents in the flight deck. The impacts had stressed the hull structure. The center shaft had been damaged. The machinery was strained. The fires had caused metal fatigue. She completed her service off Japan in July and August 1945, then transported troops and liberated prisoners after the Japanese surrender. She was placed in reserve in March 1947. Engineers assessed her condition. The war damage was more extensive than initially believed. The armored box had protected her during combat, but the impacts and subsequent stress had deformed the hull. The centerline shaft was compromised due to structural deformation. Her machinery was exhausted. The hangar fire in May 1945, caused when a Corsair accidentally fired its guns into an Avenger, had acted like a furnace within the armored box. The contained heat had warped internal structures. Repairs would be extensive. The cost was deemed prohibitive. Formidable was sold for scrap in 1953. She was broken up at Inverkeithing. She had served 12 years. Her sister Illustrious was also scrapped in 1956, worn out by accumulated war damage. Indomitable suffered a gasoline explosion in her hangar in 1951. The explosion was minor by American standards. An Essex-class carrier would have vented the blast and continued. But the explosion occurred within Indomitable's armored box. The contained blast caused severe structural damage. She was patched with concrete for the Coronation Review in 1953, then scrapped. Only Victorious received major reconstruction. She was extensively rebuilt in the 1950s to operate jet aircraft. She served until 1969, carrying Gannets, Scimitars, Sea Furies, Seahawks, Sea Vixens, and Buccaneers. But even her reconstruction required addressing structural deformations caused by wartime damage. There is a persistent myth that the British armored carriers were worn out by hard service. The last 2 Illustrious-class carriers, Implacable and Indefatigable, were only used for a couple of years and did not work as hard as American carriers. They were scrapped not because they were worn out by operations, but because they were poorly built. Wartime construction emphasized quantity over quality. British Admiralty records quote, planned reconstructions giving war-built cruisers an expected life of only 10 years. The armored flight deck saved lives. It prevented catastrophic damage. It allowed carriers to continue operations after hits that would have crippled American carriers. But it did not make the ships invulnerable. The armor protected the vital spaces. It contained damage, but the impacts, the stress, the contained fires, the accumulated trauma took their toll on the structure. The ship survived the war, but not the peace. USS Franklin survived her catastrophic damage. She was repaired. She was redesignated multiple times. Attack carrier CVA-13 on October 1, 1952. Anti-submarine carrier CVS-13 on August 8, 1953. Aircraft Transport EAVT-8 on May 15, 1959. But she never went to sea again. She remained mothballed at Bayonne, New Jersey until she was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on October 1, 1964, and scrapped. She and USS Bunker Hill were the only Essex-class carriers that never saw post-war service. Their wartime damage had been successfully repaired, but the Navy chose not to use them. The lesson was clear but complicated. Armored flight decks saved lives in combat. They prevented catastrophic damage from single hits, but they concentrated blast effects within the ship's structure. They required complex repairs after damage. They aged poorly. The trade-off was acceptable during wartime, when immediate operational capability mattered more than long-term structural integrity. In peacetime, when repair costs and service life mattered, the economics shifted. Modern carrier design reflects this understanding. Flight decks are armored, but the armor is part of a comprehensive protection system that includes blast venting, fire suppression, damage compartmentalization, and structural reinforcement. The goal is not just to survive a hit, but to survive repeated hits without accumulating invisible structural damage that will compromise the ship years later. On May 9, 1945, after the second kamikaze strike, sailors on Formidable swept debris off the flight deck. They joked about the bump. They called their ship the Lucky Ship. They did not know they were sweeping up pieces of the pilot. His wristwatch, still on his wrist, had stopped at the moment of impact. A gunnery officer was observed using a long stick to poke remaining pieces off the funnel. The gallows humor was a coping mechanism, but the name stuck. Formidable was lucky. She was hit twice in 5 days by aircraft-carrying bombs. The bombs exploded on her deck. She lost 17 aircraft and 9 men. She continued fighting. Any American carrier hit under similar circumstances, with fueled and armed aircraft on deck, would have suffered hundreds dead and been withdrawn for months of repairs. The armor worked. That was the point. Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson, 3rd Sea Lord and Controller of the Navy in 1936, had been determined not to simply modify the previous unarmored Ark Royal design. He believed carriers could not be successfully defended by their own aircraft without some form of early warning system. Radar was still primitive. Fighters might not intercept attackers before they could release their weapons. The carriers had to be able to take hits. His reasoning was sound. Between June 1944 and December 1945, Formidable steamed 112,823.5 miles in 6,118 hours and 11 minutes. She operated in the Mediterranean, the Norwegian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. She was bombed by Stukas, attacked by kamikazes, hit repeatedly. She survived every attack. Her crew suffered 200 casualties over the entire war. USS Franklin lost 807 men in 2 minutes. The numbers tell the story. The philosophy matters. When you assume you will be hit, you build differently. When you assume your fighters will keep you safe, you optimize for offense. Both approaches work until they don't. The question is, what happens when the assumptions prove wrong? For Formidable's crew, the assumptions were validated twice in 5 days off Sakishima. The kamikazes came through. The armor held. The ship continued fighting. They swept up the debris, filled the dent, and launched aircraft within the hour. This was not courage or luck or British determination. This was engineering. This was design philosophy made steel. This was the understanding that in war, the question is not whether you will be hit, but whether you will survive it. The ship that refused to be repaired was never meant to avoid damage. She was meant to absorb it, contain it, and continue fighting. She did exactly that. The cost came later, in structural deformations and accumulated stress that made peacetime repairs uneconomical. But in May 1945 off Sakishima, with kamikazes breaking through the defenses and bombs exploding on deck, Formidable proved the concept absolutely. 3 inches of hardened steel, 4.5-inch armored sides, an armored box around the hangar. These features saved hundreds of lives. They kept 4 carriers operational during the Okinawa campaign when every flight deck mattered. They proved Admiral Henderson right and validated a design philosophy that emerged from realistic assumptions about modern warfare. The dent in Formidable's flight deck, filled with concrete and covered with tack-welded steel plate, remained visible for the rest of her service life. Pilots had to account for the bump when landing. It was a constant reminder of what had hit them and what it held. 2 kamikazes in 5 days, 2 dents in the deck. 9 men dead instead of 800. The armor did not make them invulnerable. It made them survivors. That was enough.